Welcome to the Sweet Paths of Finding podcast. Today we have Dr. Alan Ruddock. Welcome, Alan.
How are you doing, James?
I'm all
right?
good, thank you. I'm all good. Day after Thanksgiving, well, we do this live, but when people listen to this, it might be a couple of weeks away. But regardless, doing well. But for people who don't know you, Alan, do you want to maybe just give a brief background about yourself?
Yeah, no worries. So I've got multiple different roles and responsibilities. So I work at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. I'm Associate Professor of Sport Physiology and Performance. And I've got multiple roles at the university. I'm course leader for the undergraduate program in Sport and Exercise Science. I've got about 400 students on the course. I'm taught research ethics lead and laboratory director as well. And as part of my role at the university, I kind of got three different roles that I fulfill: researcher and consultant. So I'm a physiologist. So I'm that horrible person that puts people on bikes and treadmills and makes them
pokes needles in them.
Until they can, puts things on them and in them, and then uses all that fancy equipment that we've got at the university to try and make sense of how the body's responding to exercise or how the body's adapting to exercise, and then create training recommendations or training program on the basis of that information. So that's in terms of research and consultancy, my main area is physiology, dabbling in a little bit of nutrition every now and again. Some PhD students working on various different projects and master's students as well. So I've co-authored papers all the way through from microvascular function, near-infrared spectroscopy, all the way to scientific models or scientific support models, things like that. So quite a breadth and across physiology, nutrition, strength and conditioning. I teach mainly our third year students, so coming to the end of their bachelor's degree, and postgraduate students on the doctoral programs as well. And then I've got just some managerial type roles, leadership type roles, as well as the teaching as well. So that's what I do at the university. So it's quite nice. It's quite varied. There's a lot of things going on. My day's never the same. Always got different challenges, different things going on. And then I am co-founder of Boxing Science. So Boxing Science started 2014 at Sheffield Hallam University. At the time, my co-founder, Danny Wilson, was undertaking his master's research program, and we were profiling amateur boxers. And when we were searching for literature, either in the scientific literature or just on the web generally, even back then, I mean, it's not that long ago really, but even back then there wasn't any real quality information on the training and preparatory practices of boxers, either amateur or...
It was Men's Health telling you to do burpees and battle ropes, right?
Exactly, yeah. That kind of stuff. And then you know what it's like in combat sports and boxing. It's not just the weight making practices that are dangerous, and bordering on malpractice. It's everything. It's physical preparation. It's how boxers and combat athletes are training and the education that they're receiving. So Danny finished up his master's project, and we said, you know what, we should look to do this more formal. So we went, yeah, great idea. Right, what should we call this? And we're like, well, we're doing boxing and it's science, so let's call it Boxing Science. So we registered pretty much there and then the domain name, boxingscience.co.uk, and then set about building an awful website. It was just awful. We didn't know what we were doing. We got just a kind of random template and then tried to kid ourselves that we knew how to use HTML codes and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Plugins. And we had an awful website for probably 4 years, but it allowed us to integrate YouTube, integrate Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, writing blog articles, doing a little bit of video and filming. And it was a couple of years since until we released our first product, which was something we called Train Like a Champion. And then we're on the fourth version of Train Like a Champion, and we have a better website. We paid some people to design the website for us, and get that all up and running, looking nice. And that was probably 2018, just before the pandemic. We're also training boxers and athletes, and I got pretty lucky actually. I got dropped into the to the deep end at the high level. 2012, Eddie Hearn, the boxing promoter, got in touch with us and said, "Look, we've got this kid from Sheffield. We think he's going to be world champion, but he got beat up pretty badly in his last fight. He can prepare well. Can you help him train?" So we were like, "Well, what do you know about boxing? Not much at all, but we'll learn quickly." And we did. And within 2 years, he had become world champion. So that was Kell Brook. But Danny worked from the ground up. He was visiting boxing gyms, he was delivering programs in boxing gyms, working with amateur boxers. And we built up the online side as we built the physical side. And now we've been involved in over 20 world title fights now. And work with world champions, Commonwealth champions, European, British, English, across the whole range of weight categories. Flyweight all the way to heavyweight. And male and female boxers as well. We tested hundreds of boxers as well, so we've got a testing battery, and we'll go to amateur gyms, or boxers will come in for us for testing. We've got hundreds on the database now, so we're really lucky that we're working with some top athletes. And we're really lucky that people think that our products and services are worthwhile paying for. And the business is doing well. We have our own high performance gym,
awesome.
North Sheffield. We're fully kitted out in there. So we've actually got we've just done a renovation. So we've now got things that you think about when you're first starting in S&C and sports science. It's like, right, okay, I need to make sure that I know how to do this exercise. And it might turn into, right, okay, now I need to know how to do Excel. So we kind of got a bit past that, and we're thinking, right, what do we need to think about when we're setting up the gym? Lighting, because we don't want lighting that's going to strobe on slow-mo. We want natural lighting, and we don't want that strobe effect. So we're thinking about lighting. Next, so that was the initial opening, and the next phase we're thinking, right, okay, what else do we need within the gym? We need a podcast somewhere where we
full-scale operation now.
How do you get to this point? When you're physiology, strength and conditioning coach, thinking about these elements but it's all part and parcel, isn't it? Of delivering programs and creating educational resources. In the gym now we've got a performance nutritionist with their own kitchen. We've got a podcast studio, consultancy room, sauna, ice bath, altitude center. No doubt. A few more at the time. So, we're really proud of what we've achieved.
I hope you're enjoying the chat so far. Before we get back to that, I just want to let you know that Sweet Science of Fighting is more than just a podcast. We have a full training app with strength conditioning programs for strikers, grapplers, and MMA athletes, so you don't have to think about what you're doing, and you're getting access to the latest scientific methods to improve combat sports performance. We have programs specifically for judo, for jiu-jitsu, for wrestling, MMA, boxing, Muay Thai is coming soon. All these things are going to be in the training app. We also have a private community where some of the coaches that have been on the podcast are in there to help you with any training questions and any performance questions you have. For example, Andrew Usher and Casper DeWitt. We also have some online courses within the training app. They cover strength, conditioning, mental skills, and weight cutting. And finally, we now have Ryan Villalobos in the community, a second degree jiu-jitsu black belt, who is there to break down any of your grappling matches that you want seen to by a second eye. He's currently breaking down videos on a separate Sweet Science of Fighting YouTube channel, and he will break down your video within the community. So if you have a match or a roll that you just recorded, you can upload that in there and Ryan will break that down for you. So what are you waiting for? jump down in the description. You can check out the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground. Otherwise, enjoy the podcast. But I wanted to start on the altitude training side because Dr. Chris Kirk, he's been on the podcast before. Anyone listening can go back and listen to that after this. But he mentioned you'll be a good guy to talk to around altitude training and that you've used it extensively with boxers. But for the audience now, do you maybe provide just some scientific underpinning on altitude training? Why would you even bother training at altitude or using some kind of altitude within your training or within your rest?
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth having a little bit of a history lesson.
Let's go.
To start with. So around about 100 years ago, explorers were looking at big tall mountains and going, do you know what, I fancy going up there. Fancy going up Everest. I fancy going up that one in the Himalayas. So they'd set up the mountain and they'd be like, this is really, really hard. Why is this really, really hard? And this guy over here, this Sherpa guy, finding it really, really easy to get up here. So, even in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, explorers and scientists and some medical doctors were aware of the effect of altitude on the human body. But at that time, sports science wasn't even a discipline. In the 1920s, we're talking here about the time of A.V. Hill, in Manchester, creating his own Douglas bags and using himself as a participant, testing his oxygen uptake. We're talking about Crow over in Scandinavia, setting up muscle physiology. So really, really early days, and it wasn't necessarily on the agenda for them. Fast forward to the Mexico City Olympics. Now, Mexico City situated at an altitude of around about 2,000 meters. So everyone who works in feet.
I don't know what that is in feet either.
I work in metric, so apologies. You're going to have to just converse it. Just ask Google. So it's around about 2,000 meters. And in the endurance events, what was clearly notable was that the athletes that were living at altitude and were from high altitude areas, so highlanders, were outperforming lowlanders. So, a classic event in the endurance is where you have Jim Ryan, who's an American middle distance runner, running against the Kenyan athletes. Kipkeino was the Kenyan athlete that absolutely dominated the middle distance event, 1,500 meters, I think it was, at Olympic Games. And so you had now, the US Olympic Committee, you had the Brits all going, how are these guys outperforming our guys? Especially Jim Ryan, that was a shock. He was probably favourite for the gold. And so at that time, the Scandinavians were starting to formalise their research into sports science, and they were able to make pretty accurate assessments of physiological responses. So they were looking at this and going, you know what, we need to look at the differences between these individuals, and we need to look at the effects of altitude. So there were studies done in the US where individuals, small samples, were taken up to altitude and their physiological responses were observed. And, what we know now is that physiological responses are impaired at altitude, which, for us now, that's pretty obvious. So then it became, the question of, right, so if there's some impairment, how can our athletes who don't live at altitude get better? If we go to altitude and we spend some time there, can we get adaptations that will enable our athletes to perform if they have to perform at altitude again? So there was some early research done in that areas, and that research continued up until probably the 2000s, early 2000s, kind of observational research. Now, what the thinking is that if we spend time at altitude, can our athletes perform better at altitude? Or can they come back down to sea level and perform better after they've been at altitude? And there was multiple investigations as the effect of, well, what adaptations does it cause? Now, what we need to make, first of all, is a distinction between the pressure of oxygen at altitude and the O2 concentration at altitude. So you'll often hear people say, oh yeah, that the air is thin or oxygen is lower. It's not. The oxygen percentage is the same at altitude as it is at sea level. The thing that differs is the pressure. It's the pressure of the gases that is exerting pressure on us as humans that enables oxygen to get from the air into our muscle cells for us to ultimately use it to generate energy. Now, so at altitude, pressure is a lot less. Now that means the ability for us to use oxygen to create energy is also less. So what we need our bodies to do is to help us to carry more oxygen so that we can get more oxygen into the cells so we can use it to produce energy. So at altitude, our body, specifically our kidneys and some chemoreceptors as well, they're sensing almost oxygen. So they're sensing how much oxygen we've got in our body. The kidneys will then detect low oxygen, and that will then stimulate a range of cascading cellular actions that ultimately releases more erythropoietin. So that's EPO. So sure, yourself and any listeners will know about EPO. So EPO is a natural hormone. That hormone is then released into the bloodstream. Its target site is the bone marrow, and the bone at that target site at the bone marrow is what happens then is that there is an increase in red blood cell production. And with that red blood cell production, there's an increase in hemoglobin, which is the oxygen carrying part of the blood. So when an athlete comes down from altitude and performs at sea level, the idea is that because they've got a higher hemoglobin mass, they've then got a higher oxygen carrying capacity, and they've got more potential to create energy, which then can be used for mechanical work, and then be used to run faster, cycle harder, row faster with more power. That's the theory behind altitude training, some of the cellular mechanistic responses to living at altitude.
Perfect. I've got a bunch of questions down here to dive into as well on altitude training. But first one is actual strategies. So typically, I think most people, or at least the theory, most people are told to live high, train low. Obviously, that's not always feasible. Is that something then that, if perfect world, that would be the perfect way to do altitude training?
Yeah. Live high, train low is a perfect way. Now, that type of training, that model of altitude training, has come from the scientific literature. Now, I don't want to say the scientific literature is poor, but it's really difficult to do altitude study. So if we think about some of the logistics that we've got to put in place to undertake an altitude training study. So most institutions around the world are at sea level. So first of all, we've got to find a location that is at altitude. For us, for me, in Sheffield, we're sea level. So, and there's nowhere in Britain that we can go to get high enough to stimulate some of the adaptations.
How high would you need to be
training
in terms of that living? Okay.
2,000, about 2,000 meters. Yeah. You start to see impairments in performance between 1,000 to 1,500 meters. It's a very individual, related. So someone could find 1,000 meters difficult. Someone could find 1,500 meters very difficult. So first of all, we've got to find somewhere to do that. Then we've got to find a sample to take over. So a sample of the population, and we've got to take them out to do altitude training for how long? Well, probably as a minimum, certainly this is what we thought early on, 3 weeks. Now, the financial implications, the resource implications of doing that and taking a sample out and living at altitude is a lot of resource, a lot of money, a lot of logistics. And that's just a single group design. Ideally, we want to do a parallel group design. So we'd have to do something with another group at a lower level as a control group. So, it's really, really difficult to do altitude training just from a logistical perspective. And then we need to think about, well, what are the key variables we want to assess? Easy things like performance, oxygen uptake, other cardiorespiratory variables. But the main variable we want to track is hemoglobin mass. And there are not many institutions that can assess hemoglobin mass because it requires specialist personnel, specialist equipment. So it's really, really difficult. So those original live high, train low models, yes, they are valid, but they have been derived from single studies. And those single studies have also muddied the water a little bit because some athletes or some individuals adapt and perform better at sea level, and some don't. And so this concept of responders, non-responders came about as well. Perhaps came about without that assessment of hemoglobin mass or being as controlled as it could be. Now, what we know now is that elite athletes won't just live high and then train low for one time within a season. They'll do it multiple times over multiple years. So it requires a lot of planning and a lot of research to be able to do that. And they have access to assessments of hemoglobin mass and will be tracking everything. You got to think about other considerations around there as well. Training load, how you're tapering for altitude, how you're manipulating training load at altitude, nutrition, illness, all those factors as well that play a role in the success of an altitude training camp. So yes, live high, train low is kind of what's seen as the optimal, but there are so many factors in between that can play a role in the success of an altitude.
Yeah, I think the Welsh rugby team actually does that. They did it for, I know, not for the World Cup just gone, but the previous World Cup, I know for sure they did that. I don't know if they did it for the last World Cup, but they also, I think it was research, I think it came out of the Welsh rugby camp around, they were doing watt bike sprints in an altitude chamber. And I know you mentioned you have an altitude chamber, so maybe this might be a little more practical for the listeners. Maybe they have access to one, maybe not, but it'll be interesting to go down that road anyway of, okay, so living high and then training at sea level, cool, that might be optimal, but it's not practical. But training in an altitude chamber, might actually be practical for some people. So do you want to go into some details of why train in an altitude chamber, what you're trying to get out of it, and then how that would fit, I guess, within a training regime?
Yeah. So there's an important distinction that we have to make here. And there's actually two practical tools that we can consider when we want to do something like altitude training. So the distinction that I made regarding altitude training and the pressure that is different at altitude is something that we need to consider when we're undertaking altitude training at sea level. So at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is the same when we go in an altitude 10 or an altitude chamber. It's normal baric, we call it. Yeah, so it's the same. And the only thing that we're manipulating when an athlete is in a chamber or in a tent is the oxygen concentration within that environment. So that is how we're simulating altitude. So we call it a simulation of altitude rather than altitude training. So that is a real key differentiator. So what happens when you're in an environment and you've got a low oxygen concentration? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? You're not going to be able to drive O2 into the muscle at the required amount, especially if you're doing some high intensity work as well. So there are altitude chambers, there are altitude tents, there are two types of altitude mask. So one type is where you can actively feed in hypoxic air. So hypoxic air is air with a reduced O2 content in there. And so there's the direct method, and then there's what you've probably seen a lot of and seen a lot of athletes use, and these are these altitude masks. Now, the altitude masks do manipulate oxygen content, but it's unregulated. The main thing that altitude masks are manipulating is the flow of air. So a reduced flow of air restricts the amount of O2 that can get into the body, and then you can eventually use it to create energy. But it can be used as a tool, just like anything can be used as a tool. We just need to know, when and how to use it. So it becomes a bit more of, for me, an inspiratory muscle trainer, because it's harder to get that volume and of air that you require, and especially if you're doing high intensity interval training. So it becomes a bit more like an inspiratory muscle trainer than it does an altitude system. Can actually probably get a little bit dangerous because of the carbon dioxide build up within the mask as well, which is poisonous if much of it. And those masks, if you're not careful, can impair training quality. So there's some considerations you have to make when you're using the masks. In terms of the tents, at Boxing Science, we don't use our altitude tent for the reasons that you would go to altitude to train. So we're not using an altitude tent to simulate altitude and stimulate adaptations in hemoglobin mass, red blood cell production. That's not what we're using it for. We use it as part of a deload or an increase in training load as an athlete is returning back to camp. The reason why we do that is because O2 concentration in the tent is low, which means that an athlete can either run as hard or cycle as hard in the tent. But because that O2 content is low, we still get a good cardiorespiratory demand, and we're still stimulating cardiorespiratory adaptations, but we're not getting that mechanical demand associated with a similar type of cardiovascular demand if we were to do it in a normoxic environment, so 20.9% normal gym air-conditioned environment. So we'll strategically use the altitude tent as either a return to training or as a method of conditioning if an athlete's got an injury, or in a planned deload week.
Gotcha. And then around, I think it was from that same Welsh paper that I was talking about before. I haven't read it in a long time, but potentially because of the increased training load as well in an simulated altitude tent or chamber, you could use it almost as like a short peaking method potentially. So if you're doing a couple times a week sprint, like bike sprints in there or whatever it is, because the training load's so much higher, you could potentially see greater gains that way, or is the fact that it's reducing outputs potentially so greatly that it's probably not worth doing?
Yeah, it depends, doesn't it? I know French rugby do the same as well, so they'll do repeat sprints in hypoxia, and it depends upon what you're after. We don't use it like that, so whatever training method you're using, you should have a good understanding of what adaptation you're trying to induce. So it could be used as a peaking or preparatory method from a more psychophysiological perspective, because if you know that training session is simulating the time motion demands of the activity, so repeated sprints in rugby, so a phase of play that's really, really intense, but the oxygen content within the environment is low, increasing the perception of the demand of the exercise, then it feels it's more pressurized environment and it's more psychophysiological, because then you can say to an athlete, look, you produce this power output under this oxygen concentration. So when the going gets tough and you've got, you might be in the 78th minute and you've got to repeat phases of play multiple times and put in multiple efforts, then you can do it because you've done it in this simulated environment. So that could be one way of thinking about it. In terms of adaptations, if I'm doing repeated sprints, and this is just my training philosophy, if I'm doing repeated sprint training, I want my mechanical demand, so the power that I'm producing on a watt bike, to be as high as possible. And I don't want things impairing my ability to produce high power outputs repeatedly. So I will consider the training that we do before, the training phase before, to optimize repeat sprint ability so that we can maintain those high mechanical demands. And I'll be looking at ways to tweak the recovery interval to make sure that I've got a high force production, high power production within that session. But that's just my approach. Everyone's got different approaches, haven't they, and different reasons. And it's really difficult to understand really think about that rationale for a training session. It's easy to look at it on social media, YouTube, wherever, and go, oh yeah, they're doing that. Yeah, they're doing that. That looks good. But okay, but why are they doing it? You might look good, but why are they doing it? So getting that rationale and reasoning behind training programs is really important, but it's really difficult to get.
Obviously, you mentioned around the simulated altitude. You're not doing it for these specific altitude adaptations around oxygen delivery, but is training in an simulated altitude, say a few times a week, is that going to eventually potentially give you that, or is it just not enough time in there?
No, it's not. I don't think it's enough time to do it. So what happens if you're thinking about how those adaptations are induced? We've got that response from the kidneys that downregulates enzyme production, that almost like makes a mark in some transcription factors, that then upregulates the production of EPO, and then EPO has to circulate through the cardiovascular system till it gets to its target site. Then it has to work on the bone marrow. And these are large, physiological effects that have to take place over a long period of time. So, we're talking minimum 3 weeks if you are a so-called responder. And then if you're not, then which we, some of the top guys in this field are saying that there are no responders and non-responders. They're just well-planned training camps and, not so well-planned training camps. But even that 3 week minimum really to stimulate that altitude, and that's living high
for 3 weeks
for 14, 16 hours a day, and then dropping down to train. So it's just not enough. Plus, off the top of my head, and I don't think there are any scientific studies that have investigated hemoglobin mass changes as a result of simulated altitude. What I do know, though, James, is that there has been a study published recently looking at the cross-adaptation of heat training and hemoglobin mass production. So there is some emerging evidence that there are potentially some crossovers from training in the heat and acclimatizing to heat or acclimating to heat, and potential physiological adaptations that benefit altitude or response to altitude.
Interesting. Okay. And I also wanted to dive into some practical ideas around, say a fighter's training at sea level, but they have to go compete at altitude. So, I don't know, for example, Denver, Colorado, or most of Denver is at altitude and things like that. And I remember when I was working with rugby here, we would have to travel to Denver and play at altitude, which was always a bitch. But well, are there some strategies that someone can undertake? So they don't have access to any kind of altitude training equipment. What can they do in terms of training and in terms of travel?
1 second, I've got a low battery.
Yeah, plug that in.
We don't want that to go down, do we?
Oh, we actually have a comment here as well saying Andrew Usher saying he's completed a study on heat and hemoglobin. All right, Andrew, you got to send that through then at some point.
Yeah.
But do you want to? Yeah, let's go into that question about the travel and the training for someone who's training at sea level and then going to potentially compete at altitude.
Yeah, I'll catch up with Andrew and see what he's got. Loads of interesting stuff.
Definitely,
with Andrew. Yeah. So first of all, it's going to be really, really challenging, isn't it? So if you do not have access to an altitude tent or altitude chamber, then what we need to be looking at is probably some muscle buffer training. So that is probably going to be the most physiologically limiting scenario, situation, or physiological response to altitude. In that pH will drop, the internal cellular environment will become more acidic, and that will make the cell's job harder either to produce or maintain neuromuscular stimulus, so you can maintain high power output, high forces, or just for glycolytic flux and just getting glycogen broken down and getting it through those energetic pathways, so it can be passed through the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. Muscle buffer training works in a way that you create almost kind of mops that will come in and will mop away those metabolites that make the cells more acidic. So we're talking here like inorganic phosphate. We're talking about hydrogen ions, and these are the components that will make exercise, especially high intensity exercise at altitude, really, really difficult. So I would be looking at muscle buffer training. So Boxing Science would do this a few ways. We're looking enough to have a blood lactate analyzer, and so we can program training to elicit mild to moderate acidosis. So we're using lactate as a marker of acidosis. So we know it's not the bad guy. We know it's not causing the acidosis, but
people need to take that in. People need to make sure they listen to that little part again. That lactate's not the bad guy.
Lactate is a really, really good guy. But yeah, it continues to get a bad name. But yeah, so we're just using lactate as a marker of acidosis, just because of its relationship with hydrogen ions and an acidic cellular environment. And we're looking to undertake interval training so that our athletes are experiencing a blood lactate concentration for between 10 and 12 millimole per litre for anywhere between 15 and 25 minutes. And that can take various different forms. So we can do a 2-minute interval with a 3-minute break, or we can do something even higher intensity. So we can do a 12-second sprint with a 48-second recovery interval and just repeat that a minute every minute for between 15 and 25 repetitions. And that's really tough session. But muscle buffer training would be my go-to if I had an athlete that wasn't able to train at altitude and that there wasn't any way in which we could simulate altitude neither.
Yeah.
It's tricky. And there's also supplementation.
What in particular was supplementation?
Beta-alanine here. Avoid sodium bicarbonate as much as you can. Yeah, but potentially. You can microdose it. That might help. The creams that you can get, still, have you seen the creams?
I don't think I have.
Sodium, so you can get sodium bicarbonate integrated within the cream, and then you can put the cream on muscles. Again, evidence is emerging and the delivery pathways are still unclear, and whether or not it exerts a true ergogenic effect is, jury's still out on that. But again, it's something to consider. And the other thing, James, something that we've done is just throw everything at the athlete. To, if you're a sports scientist, so if you're an athlete, you're not going to be able to do this because it's not going to work. But if you're a scientist or a coach, use the placebo effect to your great advantage. So throw everything at them. I've done this before when I had a fighter that's got to fight in 4 weeks, and he needs to get ready. So you've got to. There was no real concerns over making weight. It was over fitness. So we threw everything at this guy. We were wearing lab coats. We were wearing lab coats to make him feel like he was getting something that was super scientific. We were taking as much blood samples as we could, lactate. We were giving maximum encouragement all the way through. We were logging everything. We were typing away on laptops, entering information, sticking charts in front. We were in an altitude tent, and all this stuff, apart from the training that we're doing, which was sprints. It was sprint training. It was like sprint interval training, basically. Apart from that, none of this stuff had any real effect. We were just creating the environment and the illusion that this training was more effective than regular training. And so we're using, that placebo effect to our advantage. And I think placebos get a pretty bad name as well, I think, from the opposite, mainly. We can use it to our advantage, and we can. There's a great paper called Line to Win, in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. And it's effectively that. It's using the placebo effect to your advantage, and trying to do everything you can to maximize the belief system of the athlete to give them as much confidence as possible. Because when you're 4 weeks out from a fight, we're wearing lab coats, but usually I would wear my metaphorical lab coat at the start of camp. So 12 weeks out, if not further, and we'll be looking at, okay, what adaptations we're getting from this particular training session? How can we optimize adaptations and look at it from a real scientific perspective? And then as you progress through camp, my lab coat comes off. 4 weeks out and closer, I'm wearing a metaphorical coach's baseball cap there. And I'm not really interested too much about adaptations. I'm interested about how can I make my athlete feel great? How can I make them feel like the past 6 to 8 weeks of work are now translating into sparring and benefiting their performance? What can I do? What can I say to them? How can I it's almost amateur psychology. So I'm a physiologist. I know nothing about psychology, but you've got to be able to understand your athlete and find out what gives them confidence and put that coach's hat on now and take the lab coat off. Unless you're chucking placebos at
I love it. And around the travel aspect as well, I've heard many different things, like you should travel as close as possible so you don't get hit by altitude, or you should travel 5-7 days out to adapt to altitude, as an example. What's your take on travel for that?
Well, I'm definitely in the preparation camp for anything. So I think you've got to look at risk versus reward here. And if you're an athlete and you don't know how you're going to react to altitude, then you're going to want to try and program some time in to spend at altitude and just get as used to it as you can. It's going to be more psychological than physiological. There will be some acute adjustments, so there will be some changes to plasma volume, things like that. So staying on top of hydration, staying on top of nutrition, looking after your immune system, all those kind of things are really, really important. Like all travel is, no matter what you do, it's stressful. But if you know how you respond, then you could do a smash and grab and get in there. But it's so individualized, and I don't think, even from the scientific literature, we are not very confident about what type of altitude training we should use, whether we're adapting through the week, whether we need multiple camps. And unfortunately, we are more than likely going to have to rely on second-hand accounts from elite athletes that have the time, have the resource, have the logistics, have the support to be able to really understand altitude training. Or someone's going to have to come on with a big bag of money and go, I want to do the best altitude training study that has ever taken place so we can learn about it. So, yes, it's difficult with altitude training because of that individual response and our lack of understanding.
We'll send a message out to Elon Musk to fund that study. He's got enough coin to put in. But I'll jump a little bit into you mentioned obviously you have a whole host of testing data from your boxes. It'll be interesting, I think, at least maybe practically for the audience too, around maybe just some norms that you typically like boxes to hit or be at regarding strength, power, conditioning, and things like that, maybe for your amateurs and professionals, just so people can maybe just get a general idea of what physical capacities typically look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and take you through our testing battery, and I'll try and remember off the top of my head what the benchmarks are. So we usually start off with an assessment of movement capability. So we've tried a lot of functional movement screens over the years, but we've basically boiled it down to an overhead squat and a single leg squat onto a bench. Boxers have pretty much got similar movement dysfunctions, so we can just identify those as soon as we can, and then scoring. It's based on a standard 5-point scale. You can do this, you can't do that. This is tight. This is overactive. That kind of stuff. And then we have an assessment of jumps. So we'll do counter movement jump, we'll do squat jump, and we'll look at the difference between those two jumps. So in effect, eccentric utilization ratio. So boxers not very, very good eccentrically. So their squat jump would be very similar to their counter movement jump. Which shows that we need to work on some eccentric capabilities. And then we'll do a reactive strength index test as well, and just look at that relationship between ground contact time and jump height. So that's a program test that we'll do there. Yeah. What do we do next? Next, we've just started looking at, and we haven't even really got a good name for this yet, but we have a dynamometer that we attach to a rack pull machine, and we're looking at here at a isometric rotational strength or isometric rotational force production. But we need to give it a fancy name.
You need to add boxing science to the name just to get some brand on there.
Yeah. We had a student last year, Ben, who undertook his master's research, and he was looking at the relationship between these values, these metrics, and landmine punch throw velocities, which we'll talk about in a minute's time. And there seems to be a pretty good relationship between that. So we have found good relationships between jump height and landmine punch throw velocities. And also we're now finding stronger associations between these isometric rotational capabilities and punch velocity, landmine punch throw velocity to be specific. So we have that test as well. So we'll do a loaded profile. So start off with, it depends on what weight they are. We'll start off with a bar, attach a gym wear, so a linear position transducer. Attach a gym wear to the end of the bar and then perform landmine punch throw. So get the barbell into a landmine attachment, get the gym wear on, and then we'll throw right side, left side, both from a backhand stance, and then depending upon the athlete, we'll load it up in certain weights. So we'll go 20 kilos, 25 kilos, 30 kilos. Heavyweights will do 40 kilos. And then we'll look at the change in velocity and plot that, and use regressions to have a look at the slopes of that relationship. And again, we don't use the test in isolation. So all the tests that I've mentioned up to this point are all used in. Yes, there are benchmarks for each one, but they're all used in aggregation. So they're all used to give us an indication of what type of athlete we've got here. So, if jumps or eccentric capability is not as good as it could be, how does that relate to a landmine punch throw velocity at a light load, at a heavy load? If we can, we'll also do a trap bar load velocity profile as well. So it's quite extensive, the amount of testing that we do, and we're not finished yet. We may also do some core hold assessments. So, we'll do prone, supine, and then both sides for lateral, and these are just ISO holds. These are the other tests have a good descriptive and prescriptive role within the training program. Core holds not so much. I kind of just well done. You've met the threshold. There's no limitation there. It's an endurance test. So sometimes we'll do that. Sometimes we won't. Depends on what we're doing and how we can do it, or where we are. We might not even be at the gym. We might be at a boxing gym somewhere. Then after that, we'll move on to the exercise tests. So we nearly always do a lactate profile assessment. So that's where we'll do nearly always on the treadmill. So we'll do 3 minutes running at a particular intensity, particular speed, 1 minute or 30 seconds rest, and then we'll increase that intensity, and then we'll keep sampling blood lactate until we find an exponential rise in blood lactate concentration, at which point we'll stop that assessment. As part of that test, we've also got heart rate, RPE, and cardiorespiratory variables as well. So oxygen uptake, for example, can look at energy expenditure as well. And then we'll do a 30-15 intermittent running test on the treadmill as well. The reason why we do that test on the treadmill is because when we try to do intermittent running tests as they are traditionally intended, which is on a field or on a court, whereby you run shuttles and turn, boxers are awful at turning. And that becomes a major limiter in their performance. So we're not actually getting a true reflection of their capabilities to perform at a high intensity intermittently. And so it just reduces the validity. And we've also found we just get horrible reliability from those assessments as well. So things like the yo-yo assessment probably got a coefficient of variation of about 10%, something like that. Ours is a little bit higher, like 12, 14% when we assessed it before. So not very reliable, which means it just decreases the confidence in our interpretation of benchmarking or any adaptations that are occurring. So we decided to come up with a treadmill version of that test. So the most basic version starts at 8 kilometers per hour. Run that for 30 seconds, hold onto the side of the treadmill, jump across the belt, 15 seconds, and then jump back on for another 30 seconds, half a kilometer faster. So that just goes faster and faster and faster and faster by half a kilometer per hour each level. The gym record is 25 kilometers per hour. Very good. Generally, you'll see decent standard boxes hitting 23 kilometers per hour. And what we've seen is there is some discriminant validity between different standards as well. So the better standard boxers, so the world champion boxers, compared to those boxers that are just starting out, will have much higher 30-15 scores. So talking 23, 23 and a half, 20, 24 versus 21, 20 kind of quantity. There we go. And then we've just started taking, the nutritionist will do skin folds, and we'll do rest and metabolic rate assessment as well. So we get a pretty decent overview of body composition, body mass, whether they're on target, and also we're now starting to try and integrate insights of rest and metabolic rate into nutritional.
Hey guys, it's me again. I just want to let you know that I also have Sweet Science of Fighting rash guards and shorts, so you can represent Sweet Science of Fighting on the mats and within competition. We have the classic, just like the shirt I'm wearing, rash guard, Sweet Science of Fighting on the front, and we have the logos on the sleeves, and then X Martial on the back. We also have that in a shorts variation, same thing, with the Sweet Science of Fighting writing on one leg, and we have the logo on the other. But my personal favorite, this is my personal favorite by far. We have this in black and white, and it is the Taniwha Protector Guardian version of the Sweet Science of Fighting logo on the back. This was designed by a Māori designer back in New Zealand, so a bit of my heritage on this jersey. It represents the acknowledgement of battle and war. It also represents strength and stability, and also has the New Zealand silver fin. But even if you're not a Kiwi, cop this. This is an awesome design. It is a custom-made design. You will not find it anywhere else. So check that. That'll also be down in the description with a discount code. But back to the podcast.
Perfect. And that 30-15 on the treadmill is actually easy for anyone to use. So if anyone's listening, 8 kilometers per hour, run that for 30 seconds, jump off to the side, 15 seconds rest, and then just increase half a kilometer speed every single time until you fall off the back.
Yeah, can't do anymore. So if you've got a harness, which most places haven't, wear a harness, or have someone with you at all times. Make sure you consult a medical doctor.
Yeah, no liability here. You can't come sue us on this podcast. But that's awesome. I think that one's probably the most practical for most people listening. In terms of practicality for some of the other jump stuff and things like that, might be a lot of people that might not be able to interpret that data or collect it. Is there any kind of strength power assessment you would give someone who doesn't have that kind of technical setup or technical knowledge?
Yeah, so for example, jump assessments are some pretty good apps about. So you don't even need an app. So you can do what's called sergeant jump against the wall. So bit of chalk on your fingertip, stick your hand in the air, mark it on the wall, do a squat jump, counter movement jump, look at the difference between the two points, and that will give you a good indication of your jump height. Or you can use the, I think it's called
My Jump 2. That's a legit. Actually, I think they have it all bundled. I think it's all bundled together now.
Just sweet. Yeah, it's called, I think it's My Jump Labs, something like that. Something Labs. Anyway, that's pretty good. And that's been validated a few times as well in scientific literature. So that's a good way of getting, an indication of reactive strength index, counter movement jump, squat jump, things like that. Like I said, the fitness assessments, certainly the 30-15 test is pretty good as well. And then in terms of strength, things that we do, trap bar, deadlift, we very rarely, it takes quite a few sessions and a few camps for most boxers to learn how to squat and then load a squat. We find trap bar deadlift is pretty good for that. But yeah, if you're lifting one and a half times body mass on trap bar deadlift for a box, that's pretty good starting.
Perfect. Have you got a little bit of time left, Alan, just to go over one last topic? Yeah, perfect. Yeah. I want to quickly dive into I guess your conditioning philosophy as well. I think red zone training is what you've coined your conditioning stuff there. You know what I mean? Maybe dive into a little bit of I guess what that actually encompasses and what that actually means within conditioning training.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a big
one. Yeah. So we define the red zone. Actually, let me start with training zone, Stephanie. So, with training zones, there are tens, probably hundreds of different ways in which you can create training zones. And my watch will force me into a 7-zone model on the bike, a 5-zone model when I'm running, and then the scientific literature, there we have more of a 3-zone model, which is demarcated by some physiological thresholds. So where there are observable changes in physiology is where we mark a training zone. So quite simply, we have a zone 1, which is easy, like recovery runs. And then we have a zone 2, where you might at the upper end do a tempo type run. That's the kind of zone that feels good. It's not too hard. It's not too easy. And then you go to zone 3, which is where you would say this is the start of interval training, which is fine. But for most people, their zone 3 would occur at around about 85% of either heart rate max or oxygen uptake. But what we would like to see is the red zone, which we define as 90% of heart rate max. So we've got red zone, which is 90% of heart rate max. So you can estimate, so we're thinking practically, you can estimate heart rate max, and there are various different methods for which you can do that. But the best way is to try and test your heart rate max and get an understanding of what it actually is, and then just take 90% of that, and whatever that is, that will be your red zone. We also use RPE a lot. So we use rating of perceived exertion, and we'll use a scale from 0 to 10. It's got a catchy name. It's called the Foster's Modified Category Ratio 10 scale. But on there, it will just give us a rating of how intense exercise is. So we're looking for athletes to be hitting 8, 9 on that scale, which is near maximum. So that's what we define as the red zone. And we'll use that metric of 90% heart rate max and above in our high intensity interval training sessions. Now, I'm going to go back to the scientific literature again and say that the definitions of different types of interval training is very, very loose. So nobody has come along and has said, this is the definition for high intensity interval training. This is the definition for another type of training. This is the definition for another type of training. Now, this gets confusing when this information enters the public domain, especially when you've got multiple training models as well. So high intensity interval training, 90% heart rate max, and that is the primary metric of interest for us when we're doing high intensity interval training. So for those listeners in the UK, there's a guy called Dr. Michael Mosley. A few years ago, he made a few series for the BBC and was talking about the benefits of high intensity interval training. And it was just basically just running on the spot and just doing some random squats in the pitch. That's not high intensity interval training. That's definitely not what it is. But people have now taken this term of HIIT and bastardized it, and it's become
now it's a fitness class.
Not. So what we need is clear definitions, because we're scientists and definitions form the basis for our understanding. Now, for me, there are 2 types of high intensity interval training. There are short and there are long. So long would be a continuous interval, probably between 4 and 8, even go to 6, I've done 16 minutes before, but generally between 4 and 8 minutes would be considered a long interval. And those intervals can be repeated 4, 6, even up to 8 times within a session. And what we're looking for there is the amount of time spent within that red zone. And ultimately what we're looking for here is the stress on the cardiovascular system, principally the heart, and we're looking to maximize or optimize stroke volume response which will then, over time, initiate cardiovascular adaptations in terms of central adaptations, so the morphology of the heart, how hard it beats, the size of its chambers, and how much blood it can pump out, but also capillarization as well, and the network of capillaries. Short interval training are intervals like 15 on, 15 off, repeated multiple times, 30 on, 30 off, repeated multiple times, and they can be done in sets of 8, 10, 12, or a whole single set of 20 repetitions. And these are done at around about the speed at which VO2 max occurs.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you're looking for the same metric. How much time are you spending at 90% heart rate max? And what we're looking for as a minimum is around about 8 minutes. Okay. That's high intensity interval training, which forms just one component of our conditioning system. The other components are, and if Andrew Usher is still,
I'm sure he's still listening.
Sprint interval training, which I know he's a big fan of, and with various different forms of sprint interval training. So do we. So we would do 30 seconds, and this sounds like it's absolutely nothing when I explain it. But 30 seconds, max effort, 3 minutes recovery, repeat 4 to 6 times.
Yeah. I know people listen to that, they go, what? And then you do one of them, and you go, fuck, I'm not going to do another one.
So we get, what are you doing? Are you seriously desire? So we get athletes just that end up in the fetal position. You just want to go to sleep with no position. That's good. But these have to be done max effort all out, because if you do not get that almost draining of the battery, if you do not initiate a highly acidic cellular environment as a result of that, you train
for sure.
So it needs to be really, really tough. So then we move on to the continuum into speed endurance training. So in speed endurance training, a really underutilized method and a really under-researched method as well. There's only a handful of decent papers, and they've all come from Jens Spangsbo's group in Scandinavia as well. 2 types: speed endurance maintenance and speed endurance production. In production, you're looking to increase to a speed or power that is relatively high but still submaximal, and then repeat that. And then maintenance, intensity a little bit less, and able to repeat that over and over and over again. And then we move into muscle buffer training. And here I've already mentioned that type of training. So we're looking to induce moderate acidosis, and various different sessions that we can do for that. 2-minute intervals, almost repeated sprints. But the primary metric is blood lactate for that. And I realise people don't have access to a 1,000 pound blood lactate analyzer. So you can use RPE for that as well. So if RPE is 7 or 8 on that category ratio 10 scale, probably in the right zone. And those sessions start off really easy. Everything else is easy. But then by the 10th or 12th rep, if you're doing 12-second intervals, you realize this is disgusting. I've done up to 30 minutes before, and that was horrific. So. So that's pretty much our high-intensity interval training continuum. And what we do and when we do it will be individual-specific, camp-specific. The last training method that I need to mention that. As we move into a taper phase, we might do more Tabatas, so 2010s, and short intervals, and just try and replicate some hand motion demands. And we can, depending on who our boxers are fighting, we can tweak that. And those are mainly, like I said before, those are mainly to give our
almost like game speed, right? Almost like game speed kind of training, you could say. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. But for us and for the boxers, interval training, high intensity interval training is a safe way to push them to their absolute limits. So, yeah, they get confidence from sparring, but if they go flat out and full capacity in sparring, they're going to get sparked out, and they're probably going to get injured. So even in sparring, they've got to be respectful of how they use their energy and respectful for any tactical or technical considerations that their coach is asking them to make. So they can't always push their limit, but they want to know where their limit is, because they're just kind of animals that do, and they're great to work with because of that. So interval training just provides that safe environment for them.
Nice. Last question before we go, around obviously zone 2 or low intensity conditioning is, I think it's still very prevalent and talked about a lot in terms of general health and conditioning. Does that, or where doesn't that fit within your training, and why or why not?
It doesn't fit all too much. The only time it comes in is in recovery sessions. So we know what that zone is. We have a pretty good idea of what energy is expended in those kind of intensities and those sessions. And so it only comes in when we need to do recovery. And the reason being is because if we think about the movement dysfunctions that our athletes have, the time that they spend boxing, and then consider their physical dominances in terms of anterior, and they're anterior dominant, internally rotated. And then we think about how many punches they throw every single session and every single week. We have to think about those mechanical demands and whether or not we want to keep putting athletes in those kind of stressful positions. Now, if we're saying, go off and go do, a tempo run, go do a 5-mile run, they're going to run it like they're boxing. It's like
it'll be like a Rocky montage going on.
Yeah, and they'll probably still be externally rotating at the feet. Definitely won't be using glutes. Their adductors will get tight. Then as a result of that, then they start getting kind of tight calves. And so we don't want to keep putting them in those stressful positions. And also we want to produce targeted adaptations as well. And if we're doing a mix of different things, or we're doing types of training that we know that adaptations take longer to induce, then we're not being optimal with our time. Most of the time, we've got 10 or 12 weeks with an athlete. Can't waste time. And they're coming to us at a baseline, and we need to improve their physical conditioning as effectively, as optimally as possible. And great, tempo like style zone 2 training for a track athlete, absolutely fine, because they're probably going to be competing at that intensity at some point, or it will contribute to their training system. We just don't have time to do it, and from a mechanical perspective, it's also pretty risky. So most of the time, we're just playing off that risk versus reward. Are we gonna see some injuries as a result of this? Are we going to spike training load if we do this? Is it optimal? Can we measure it? What adaptations we're getting from it? Lots of different questions.
Yeah, definitely. I like that take too. And it's a good way just to get an idea into your conditioning philosophy, and I guess for everyone else listening as well, just so they can kind of get a big picture. But I think we'll end this one here, Alan. Where can people find you and follow you and keep in touch with what you're doing?
Yeah, on Instagram at Ruddock, at Ruddock.
I'll find and put in the description too, so everyone can click on it.
Yeah. And then the Boxing Science Instagram page, which is just at Boxing Science. Danny's very, very active on Instagram. Danny's is Wilson _Boxing Science. And then there's the YouTube pages as well, just Boxing Science. And then Twitter, which is something like my Instagram handle. Might be @Rook_box tie. And then if people are interested in the research that we've done, there's two ways in which you can get the research papers. One is through ResearchGate. So if you just search for my name, click on ResearchGate, they're all on there. The other is through, and it's probably more difficult to find on Google, but all our papers have to have a version that is open access.
Perfect.
So the university has a repository of papers that are the accepted version of articles. So everything that I've done is on there, along with things like the blog articles or the podcast.
Awesome. I'll link that all down in the description for anyone who's interested to check those out. But thanks for coming, Alan. I appreciate it.